There is a saying in the red clay country of the Carolina Piedmont that the old-timers used to pass along in the same flat, matter-of-fact voice they used to report rainfall or the price of corn. The gully remembers every rain you ever gave it. They meant that erosion is not an accident. It is a ledger. Every drop of water that runs fast over bare ground makes a notation, and the gully is simply the sum of all the notations nobody bothered to read. Vera Sutton had heard that saying from her grandmother, who had heard it from hers, and she had come to understand it not as poetry, but as engineering. The distinction mattered to her. She was not a sentimental woman. She was a woman who had watched a 200-foot gully eat its way toward her barn over the course of 11 years, and who had decided, in the winter of her 53rd year, that she was going to answer the ledger. The method she chose would cause her neighbors to question her sanity, the county extension office to send a concerned young man with a clipboard 3 separate times, and one civil engineer from the state university to declare publicly that what she was doing was, in his precise and educated words, not how erosion control works. She did not argue with any of them. She went back to work. This is the story of what she did, why it worked, and what it cost her, and what she gave away at the end that no one expected her to give. The gully had started as a seam, a thin crease in the red clay hillside behind the Sutton farmstead, in a season before Vera was born. Her grandmother's journals, which Vera had inherited in a shoebox along with a broken pocket watch and a deed to 41 acres, describe the seam first appearing after a logging crew cut the timber on the upper slope and left the slash in windrows that channeled runoff in concentrated streams. That was 1947. By 1962, the seam had become a channel 18 inches deep. By 1981, it was a formal gully, 8 feet deep in its steepest reach, and Vera's mother had begun the slow, ruinous habit of dumping brush in it each fall, which accomplished nothing except to give the next spring's flood something dramatic to carry away. By the time Vera inherited the farm in 2011, following her mother's death, the gully was 14 feet deep at its head cut, 40 feet wide at its widest, and had consumed, by Vera's careful measurement, roughly 2 acres of productive land that her grandmother's journals had once described as the best mixed-grass pasture on the place. The head cut was advancing toward the barn at a rate she calculated, from the journals and her own observation, of approximately 12 feet per year. The barn was 88 feet from the head cut's nearest edge when Vera measured it in the spring of 2012. She did the arithmetic without sentiment. She had perhaps 7 years before the barn's foundation was undermined. She called the county Soil and Water Conservation District first, because that is what a reasonable person does. A young man named Bradley came out in a white pickup truck with a magnetic decal on the door. He walked the gully with her, nodding at appropriate intervals, and then he laid out for her the standard repertoire of remediation: riprap at the head cut, concrete-grade stabilization structures at 2 points along the channel, and seeding of the banks with a certified fescue blend. The total estimated cost, which he presented on a printed sheet, was $47,000, of which the district could potentially cost-share 30%, leaving Vera responsible for approximately $33,000. She stood at the gully's edge and looked at the figure on the sheet for a long time. She had $11,000 in a savings account. She thanked Bradley for his time. He told her he understood budgetary constraints and left a packet of informational brochures in her mailbox on the way out. She read every page of them that evening. Then she opened her grandmother's journals and read those too, not for the first time, but this time with the specific question she had not thought to bring before. Had the gully ever stopped on its own? Had anything ever slowed it? The entry she found was dated August 14, 1959. Her grandmother wrote in a dense, economical hand that was difficult in the dim lamplight, but became legible with attention. The entry read, in its entirety, moved the Duroc sows and the 6 shoats onto the east slope above the seam for 3 weeks while I repaired the lower fence. When I moved them back, the seam had closed at the top a good 6 inches on either side. Notice this only by accident. The earth there is solid as pavement where they rooted and wallowed. Worth thinking about. Her grandmother, being a practical woman, had then moved on to record the price she received for 2 barrows at the Hartwell sale, and had apparently never returned to the observation in writing. But the observation was precise, and it was dated, and it was, Vera recognized immediately, a data point. A single unreplicated data point in a 52-year-old handwritten journal was not, by any formal measure, evidence. Vera understood that. She also understood that her grandmother had possessed an empirical turn of mind, that the woman had measured and recorded and compared things all her life, and that she had been, by any fair accounting, a better reader of this particular hillside than any young man with a clipboard and a printed cost-share sheet. Vera closed the journal. She sat for a while in the dark kitchen. Then she drove to the Garrett farm 3 miles east and bought 8 Duroc cross gilts, 6 months old, for $220 each. She had not raised hogs in 12 years. She built a temporary perimeter fence from a spool of high-tensile wire and 300-odd steel T-posts she drove herself, 210 posts over 4 days in February, ground that had not fully thawed, using a manual post driver that raised a blister on her right palm the size of a silver dollar and broke it and raised it again. Her neighbor Marcus Webb, who ran a cow-calf operation on the adjacent property, and who had been friends with her late husband in the way that farm men are friends. That is to say, through proximity and occasional equipment lending rather than conversation, came by on the 3rd day and watched her drive posts for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he said she was going to kill herself driving posts alone in February and offered to bring his tractor-mounted driver the next morning. She accepted. The fence was completed by the end of the week. She built a simple 3-sided shelter of salvaged tin and rough-cut lumber on the upper slope within the fenced area where the hogs could be out of the rain. She ran a water line from the barn. She moved the 8 gilts into the enclosure on the 22nd of February and stood at the fence in the cold and watched them for a long time. The way you watch something you have staked a great deal on, which is to say with an expressionless face that conceals considerable interior motion. The hogs, being hogs, began immediately to root. This is what hogs do. They root with their snouts along the soil surface, turning the upper layer, breaking the crust, incorporating organic matter, compacting the disturbed layer with their sharp hooves as they move. They root for food, for comfort, for reasons that are entirely their own, and require no endorsement from the humans observing them. On the slope above the gully, where decades of sheet wash erosion had left a thin, compaction-prone crust of depleted clay over a denser subsoil, the rooting did 2 things simultaneously. It broke the surface crust, which had been shedding water rather than absorbing it, contributing to runoff. And then the hogs movement repacked the broken layer into a denser, more structured profile, with air channels and root channels from the grasses they were turning under, creating something that functioned, in a rough but real sense, like an infiltration bed. Vera did not have the vocabulary for this at the time. She had her grandmother's one entry and her own eyes. She watched the slope above the gully every morning. On the 11th day, she noticed that the soil immediately upslope of the head cut had changed color in a way that indicated moisture retention rather than runoff. She took a sample with a 6-inch probe and found the soil moist to depth. The same probe in the untreated slope 30 feet to the east came up dry at 3 inches. She recorded both measurements in a notebook she had purchased for the purpose at the hardware store. She recorded the date. She went back to work. Bradley from the extension office returned in April, having heard from someone at the feed store, which is where all rural intelligence originates, that Vera Sutton had put hogs on the gully slope. He stood at the fence line in his clean boots and explained to her patiently that hogs were commonly understood to be destructive to riparian and slope environments, that the standard advice was to exclude livestock from erosion-prone areas, and that he was worried she was going to accelerate the head-cut advancement rather than retard it. She listened to everything he said. She told him she appreciated him coming out. He waited for more. She offered him a cup of coffee, which he accepted, and they drank it on the porch and talked about the county's new stream buffer ordinance, and then he left. She wrote his visit in her notebook with the date and the weather conditions and a single line of commentary. He is not wrong about the general rule. I am not doing the general case. 3 days later, a professor from the state university's biological and agricultural engineering department drove out unannounced. He had heard about the hogs from Bradley, or perhaps from the feed store, the channels of information in a rural county being various and interconnected. His name was Dr. Whitfield. He was a tall, careful-looking man who wore a vest with many pockets and carried a hand level and a Brunton compass as if he might be called upon at any moment to survey something. He walked the gully with Vera and said nothing for a long time, which she respected. Then he said, "This is not how erosion control works." She said, "I know." He said, "The head cut is driven by concentrated flow energy. You cannot compact your way out of that problem. The energy will reroute around anything you build with animal traffic." She said, "Maybe." He looked at her for a moment and wrote something in a small notebook of his own and left. She was almost certain he meant well. She was also almost certain he was solving a different problem than the one she was solving, or rather that he was solving the head cut, which was the dramatic and visible part, while she was solving the hillside above it, which was the quiet and invisible part. The part that fed every flood that had ever cut the head, cut another foot deeper. She had decided, reading her grandmother's journals through the winter, that if you reduce the volume and velocity of water reaching the head cut by increasing infiltration on the slope above it, you change the energy budget of the whole system. The head cut would not be repaired. It would be starved. This was, she acknowledged to no one, a guess informed by one journal entry and her own reasoning. She drove another 12 fence posts and moved the hogs to a fresh paddock section. It was Marcus Webb who became, without ceremony or declaration, her partner in the project. He had a quality that Vera had always noticed but never had occasion to value directly, which was that he watched things carefully and drew conclusions slowly and did not feel the need to announce either process. He had watched her drive posts in February. He had watched her move the hogs. He had watched her take soil probes on the hillside in the early morning when he was moving his own cattle to the creek pasture. In late May, he came to the fence line while she was repairing a section of wire and stood for a while and said, "The color up near the head cut looks different." She said, "It does." He said, "Wetter." She said, "Yes." He said, "You need more of them." She said, "I know." He said, "I've got 4 Berkshire cross sparrows I was going to sell at Hartwell in September. You could run them with yours through the summer." She said, "What do you want for them?" He said, "Nothing." She said, "I'll give you $1 a head on whatever I get for the gilts in November." He said, "Fine," and turned back toward his cattle without further discussion. He brought the 4 barrows the next morning and helped her expand the paddock rotation system to accommodate them. They worked together most of that day without speaking, except to coordinate the fence work. At the end of the afternoon, he walked the hillside above the gully with her, both of them looking at the soil in the way that people who work land look at soil, which is with an attention that is also a kind of affection. He said, "Your grandmother grew hogs here." She said, "She did." He said, "Did she know?" She said, "I think she saw something and didn't have time to finish seeing it." He nodded and drove home. The summer was dry that year, which is to say the summer was ordinary for the Carolina Piedmont in the second decade of the 21st century. Hot and intermittent, with 2 months of below-normal rainfall, followed by a series of convective storms in August that dropped 2 to 3 inches in under an hour on 3 separate occasions. On each occasion, Vera went to the gully observation point she had established at the corner post of the upper fence and watched the water behavior. On the first August storm, she counted 11 minutes between the start of heavy rain and the first visible surface runoff from the treated slope. On the same storm, she counted 4 minutes to runoff from the untreated slope to the east, which was under a fescue stand that had been managed conventionally for 30 years. She wrote both times in her notebook. She walked down to the head cut during the storm, which was not sensible from a personal safety standpoint and which she did anyway, and observed that the flow entering the head cut from the treated slope was visibly lower in volume than the flow from the untreated side. She was soaked through by the time she got back to the house. She changed her clothes and wrote the observations down and ate supper and did not call anyone. The gully remembers every rain you ever gave it. She was changing what she gave it. That was all. That was the whole plan. The county had its own plans. In September, a meeting was held at the Extension office in Hartwell to discuss several farms in the watershed that had been flagged in a state erosion inventory as contributing sediment loads to the creek system downstream. The Sutton farm appeared on the list, as it had appeared on every such list for 20 years. Vera was invited and she attended, sitting in the back row of folding chairs in the meeting room that smelled of coffee and institutional carpet. Dr. Whitfield presented a summary of the watershed's erosion problem using maps and projected figures and recommended a coordinated program of grade stabilization structures funded through a federal conservation program. The total watershed investment he proposed was approximately $480,000 across 12 farms. When the floor was opened for questions, a man named Fowler, who owned the largest row crop operation in the county and who always sat in the front row of any meeting as if by hereditary right, said that in his view the money would be better spent on concrete structures that would last 50 years than on any biological approach, which he described with a brevity that conveyed both efficiency and contempt as hippie methods. Several people laughed. Vera did not. She was looking at the map on the projected slide, which showed the Sutton Farms Gully in red, indicating a high sediment contribution risk. She noted that the map was based on data collected in 2009. She noted that it was now 2013. She went home and measured the headcut's position again and compared it to her measurement from the spring of 2012. In 12 months, the headcut had advanced 4 feet. The year before the Hogs, her estimate from the journal suggested it had advanced 11. She wrote that in her notebook and underlined the numbers and did not go back to any meeting. Fowler himself came by in October. He drove a new 3/4-ton truck with a diesel engine that announced itself a quarter-mile down the road, and he wore the expression of a man who considers a personal visit a form of generosity. He stood at the gully's edge and looked down into it and then looked at the hogs on the slope and shook his head in a way that communicated volumes while committing him to nothing. He told Vera that he had a man who could install a concrete grade stabilization structure at the head cut for $18,000, which he happened to be able to offer her at that price because he was having 2 installed on his own place and the contractor was already mobilized. He said it was a hell of a deal and he was only mentioning it because he hated to see a neighbor's farm going the way this one was going. She thanked him. He waited. She said she didn't have $18,000. He said he might be able to work something out on the payment side. She said she appreciated that. He waited again. She said she needed to get back to the fence work. He looked at the hogs again and said, "Those animals are going to tear this slope to pieces." She said, "Probably not." He left. She knew he believed he had been generous, and she did not blame him for believing it. She also knew that his concrete structure would address the head cut and leave the hillside hydrology unchanged, and that within a decade, the runoff from the untreated slope would route around the structure and begin cutting a new head cut to one side, because that is what concentrated water energy does when you interrupt it without addressing the source of its concentration. She had read enough of Dr. Whitfield's own published papers, which she had looked up at the county library's public computer terminal over 2 evenings in July, to know that he knew this too. It was a problem the field had not fully solved. She suspected her grandmother had. By the spring of 2014, Vera had run 12 hogs through 4 complete paddock rotations on the treated slope, covering approximately 1.5 acres of the hillside above the gully in a systematic grid she had laid out using T-posts and string and a level. She had taken soil probe measurements at 32 points on the treated slope and 16 points on the comparison slope to the east, at depths of 3, 6, and 12 inches, recording moisture and, using a simple penetrometer she had ordered from an agricultural supply catalog, compaction resistance. The treated slope showed a consistent pattern. Lower penetrometer resistance at 3 inches, indicating a broken, structured upper layer. Higher resistance at 6 inches, indicating a dense, stable underlayer, and consistently higher moisture retention at all depths following rain events. The comparison slope showed the inverse: high surface resistance, low subsurface structure, low moisture retention. She was not a soil scientist. She knew the measurements were not controlled in any rigorous sense. She also knew what she was seeing, and she knew she had seen it for 2 years, and she trusted what she had seen because her grandmother had seen it first, and because the hillside itself was telling her in the plainest language available to it, which was the language of water moving or not moving, eroding or not eroding, saturating or not saturating. She expanded the rotation to cover the remaining half-acre of treatable slope above the head cut. She also, for the first time, wrote a letter to Dr. Whitfield, enclosing photocopies of her notebook pages with the probe data and the storm runoff timing observations and a brief description of the paddock rotation system. She told him she thought the system might be worth documenting properly. She did not ask for anything. She mailed the letter on a Tuesday and thought no more about it for 3 weeks. He came on a Friday in June. This time he brought a graduate student named Dion, who carried a more sophisticated soil sampling kit and a portable rainfall simulator, which is a device that applies water to a defined area of soil surface at a calibrated rate and measures the rate of runoff and infiltration. They spent 4 hours on the hillside. Vera brought them water and stayed out of their way. At the end of the afternoon, Dr. Whitfield sat on the fence rail and looked at the slope for a long time. He said, "The infiltration rates on the treated areas are 2.6 times the untreated reference." She said, "Yes." He said, "I would not have predicted that." She said, "I know." He said, "The mechanism is the hoofpack underlayer combined with the rooting-induced macropore structure." She said, "That's one way to say it." He almost smiled and said, "Your grandmother figured this out." She said, "She saw something once. I just kept looking at it." He asked if he could return in the fall with a full research team to document the system. She said yes on the condition that whatever they published would include a full transcription of her grandmother's August 1959 journal entry. He said, "Absolutely," without hesitation, and she believed him, and he was true to his word. Dayon, who had been quiet all afternoon in the way that people are quiet when they are taking in something they will think about for years, said on his way back to the truck, "How did you know it would work?" She thought about it for a moment. She said, "I didn't. I knew it had worked once." She went back to the slope to move the hogs to the next paddock. The journal entry was published in the appendix of a paper in the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation in the spring of 2016. The paper documented a 43% reduction in estimated sediment discharge from the treated sub-watershed between 2012 and 2015, against a comparison area that had received standard fescue management and one concrete grade check dam installation during the same period. The head cut advancement rate on the Sutton farm, measured at the beginning and end of the study period, was 2.1 feet over 3 years combined, against a prior estimated rate derived from journal records and aerial photography of 11 feet per year. The concrete structure on the comparison property had required emergency repair after the second year, when runoff had routed around its eastern end and begun lateral cutting. Vera read the paper twice when Dr. Whitfield mailed her a copy. She thought it was accurate. She thought it was also somewhat bloodless in its language, which was the nature of such documents and was not a criticism. The paper credited her in its acknowledgments section. Dion, who had completed his master's degree using the Sutton Farm data, sent her a copy of his thesis with a handwritten note on the title page. She kept the note and filed the thesis on the shelf next to her grandmother's journals. The year the paper was published, Bradley from the Extension Office called to ask if she would be willing to present her system at the watershed meeting that fall. She said she would. She drove to the Extension Office in Hartwell on the third Thursday of October and stood at the front of the same meeting room with the institutional carpet and the smell of coffee and spoke for approximately 25 minutes without notes because she did not use notes when she spoke about things she knew. She described the paddock rotation system in plain terms. She described the soil probe measurements and the storm timing observations. She described her grandmother's journal entry and the 80-page context of careful observation that surrounded it. She said that the initial investment in the 8 gilts, the T-posts, and the wire had totaled approximately $3,000, and that the sale of the 12 hogs over the 3-year study period had returned approximately $4,100, making the net cost of the system negative. The system had paid for itself and generated a modest surplus. She said she was not suggesting that everyone should do exactly what she had done, because every hillside had its own character and every gully had its own ledger, and you had to read the specific ledger of the specific place you were working on. She said that was all she knew. There was a silence in the room that she recognized as the particular silence of people recalibrating. Fowler, who was again in the front row, said nothing for a long moment and then said, "What do you need for posts and wire these days?" She told him the per-unit cost. He wrote it in a small notebook. It was the most useful thing he had done in relation to her situation since he had offered the contractor's number 3 years before, and she was glad of it. The thing about a gully is that it takes a long time to starve. The head cut on the Sutton farm did not close. It did not reverse. It remained a 14-foot deep scar in the red clay hillside, and it will remain one for decades, because the land's memory is long in both directions. What changed was what fed it, which is the only change that is ever permanent. By 2017, the head cut's advance had ceased. By 2019, the banks had begun to revegetate naturally, native grasses seeding in from the treated slope above, their roots binding the upper clay. Marcus Webb, who had continued to run his Berkshire crosses through the rotation each summer in exchange for a token payment that Vera insisted on, walked the head cut with her in the fall of 2019 and said it looked different. She said it did. He said, "Smaller." She said, "Not smaller. Slower." He said, "Is that enough?" She said, "It's what the place can do. That's enough." He nodded. They walked back to the barn in the early October light, which was the specific amber color of that latitude and season, a color that has no adequate name in English, and that Vera had been seeing all her life without knowing she was registering it until she was old enough to understand that some things only become visible through accumulation. She began teaching the system formally in 2018, the year she turned 60, conducting what she called farm walks for small groups of farmers from 3 counties who had heard about her from the extension office or from Dr. Whitfield's students or from the paper, which had been cited more times than she tracked. She charged nothing for the farm walks. She showed people the probe technique and the paddock rotation layout and, always, the journal. She read the August 1959 entry aloud at every walk, in full, without paraphrase, because she believed the exact words mattered in a way that summary did not. After she read it, she would say, "She was looking at this hillside when she wrote that." She looked at it once and moved on. I just stood still long enough to see what she saw. Some of the people who came to the farm walks drove long distances. Some of them came back the following year and brought neighbors. Dion came back twice with different cohorts of graduate students, and Vera liked him and his students and appreciated their careful, slow attention to what the hillside was showing them, though she always corrected them when they tried to make the system more complex than it was. It was not complex. It was patient. Those are different things. Marcus Webb died in the winter of 2021, a heart attack in the machinery barn on a cold morning in January, which is how farm men of his generation and temperament tended to go, at work and without fuss. He was 71. Vera had known him for 40 years, which is to say she had known him for almost her entire adult life, and she sat in the pew at the Baptist Church in Hartwell and felt the specific weight of that kind of loss, which is not the sharp grief of sudden things, but the heavy, rearranging grief of losing a person who had been part of the structure of your days, without either of you ever having said so directly. She went back to the farm afterward and walked the hillside. The hogs were in the lower rotation paddock, 8 of them, a mix of her own stock and 2 barrows from the Webb farm that Marcus's son had asked her to run through the summer, which she had agreed to. She stood at the head cut's edge and looked down into it, and then up at the slope, and then across the creek to the country beyond it, which was the ordinary red clay and pine and hardwood country of the Piedmont, neither dramatic nor particularly beautiful except to people who had stood in it long enough for it to become theirs. The Gully remembers every rain you ever gave it. She had changed the rain she gave it. That was still true. She went back to the barn and filled the water troughs and measured the afternoon's probe readings in her notebook, which was the 14th notebook she had filled since February of 2012, and which sat on the same shelf as the 13th and the 12th and all the others, next to the shoebox of journals and the broken pocket watch and the deed to 41 acres. In the spring of 2023, a young woman from the next county came to Vera's door. She had driven 40 miles on a Tuesday morning, which indicated a kind of determination that Vera recognized. Her name was Amara. She had a gully of her own, she said, 230 feet long on a slope her family had owned since her grandfather had bought it in 1978, and the county had told her the remediation cost was $63,000, and she did not have $63,000. She was 29 years old. She had her grandfather's land records in a folder under her arm. Vera made coffee and sat down at the table and looked at the land records and asked Amara 7 or 8 questions about the slope's orientation, the soil type, the drainage pattern, the land use history above it. Then she drove with Amara to her farm and walked the gully and the hillside above it for 2 hours, taking notes on a folded sheet of paper. Then she sat on the tailgate of Amara's truck and told her what she thought, in plain terms, without promising anything, because you cannot promise anything about land or weather or time. She told Amara about the paddock rotation system and about the probe method and about the journal. She told her it would take 3 years to see whether it was working and 5 years to know. She told her the first-year costs would run about $3,000 if she was careful and bought her gilts at the right sale. She told her that Marcus Webb had taught her that you did not have to do it alone if you found someone who would watch carefully and say little. She told her that her grandmother had seen the whole thing in one afternoon in August 1959 and had written it in 11 lines and moved on, and that what Vera had done, really, was simply decide that 11 lines were enough to act on. She drove home in the late afternoon and put the folded paper in a new notebook, which would be the 15th. At the bottom of the first page, she wrote the date and the weather and a single line. The Gully remembers every rain you ever gave it. Time to change the rain.